I see what you mean, but it might be one question, because Jameson, I think, would sort of turn that into one particular question. I think part of it is Jameson's view of Marxism is that it's the only science, I'll use the 19th century term for it, that in fact does look at everything, that believes that it is all in a way interconnected in a sort of vulgar Marxist, and actually I use the vulgar Marxist in a somewhat positive way here. Jameson, despite all of his sophistication, has in fact referred to himself almost jokingly as a vulgar Marxist. So vulgar Marxism, for those of you not familiar, involved a sort of, it's also known, was once known at least as orthodox Marxism. But it's the view that basically everything that is not economic is just superstructural, epiphenomenal, that the economic base determines everything else. And there is some evidence for that in Marx, although I think determines may be a little stronger. I prefer the kind of phenomenological term, conditions. It certainly affects everything else, but not in such a direct way as simple cause and effect. And so Jameson's view is that because of this sort of infrastructural base that then relates to everything else, Marxism would be the science that looks at capitalism as a whole, not just, say, at wages or at the relationship between, say, real estate prices and labor costs and things like that. So his critique of economics was that it was too partial. But similarly, Jameson's going to go farther, and this is part of that embrace like a python thing that Jameson was doing. He talks in some of his essays, the late 70s, and really the first chapter of The Political Unconscious, about how Marxism has no problem at all with people being deconstructive critics or new historicists or Lacanian psychoanalytic critics, because all of those deliver real truths that we ought to pay attention to. They just deliver partial truths. The whole picture would have to be provided by Marxism, which would, of course, incorporate the psychological, recognizing that, for example, the ego is not autonomous and outside of social and collective things, and therefore needs to be studied the way Freud did study it, but studied it in connection to all these other things. And so Jameson's Marxism, which I guess would be really frustrating if you're trying to get around him, is like, he would say, well, you're right, you're just not all right. If you just added Marxism to your picture, you'd have a better picture. The other thing, your sort of first question that became the second question too, why map the totality, kind of follows from that. Jameson would suggest, and he would say it comes out of Hegel, or a Hegelian Marxist tradition, that you can't understand even these other phenomena unless you understand the totality. It is, in a sense, and again he uses this term that Althusser popularized coming from Spinoza, but the absent cause, the notion that every little thing we want to look at, it can only be fully understood, is only fully meaningful in connection to the totality of all things. And I once heard him say this, I'm sure it's in print somewhere, but I can't think of a site, but I heard a lecture he gave where he mentioned that to the extent that that the totality becomes the thing we have to try, and by the way, fail. There's no way we can do this. We don't have minds for it. And so it's this is part of the frustration, but part of the joy. The frustration being that you're always going to fail, the joy being you always get to try. It never ends, in that sense. But he once described this sort of as like anti or opposite of Descartes. So whereas Descartes tried to break down everything to the petite principle from which you could then build it back up and scrape away everything else, to the one meaningful thing that he could, use as his Archimedean point to then, build up the universe again. I'm sorry, I'm mixing my philosophical metaphors. The idea would be, for a Hegelian, so Jameson might say, you need to say everything before you can begin. So instead of breaking it down a little, you need to extrapolate out to everything. And as I say, that's the theory. It's almost always impossible, and so Jameson does have this. It's a nice mix between the kind of elegiac sense of sort of dealing with fragments, shoring our fragments up against the ruins and whatnot, and this sort of joyful sense of look at what we get to do. Talking about the failure, he always refers to the totality as an unrepresentable totality, but then always as an attempt to represent it. Hence the references to, you know, the fitful, you know, meditation on the subjects and whatnot. And this is quasi-mystical. Jameson has, I think, been accused of like embracing everything else, embracing a kind of religious language, but I think he borrows that from Marx too. Marx talks about going into the sort of shadowy and mythical domain of religion when he talks about commodity fetish in Capital Volume 1. But there is an almost mystical sense, because he talks about this notion that I kind of quoted at the end, that part of what Marxism is a theory of history that says the next thing coming is already in emergence around us. So he makes reference to like the chrysalis and, you know, the form that is stirring within the shell, or again the seeds of time and that sort of thing. The view that we don't know what the revolution or the post-revolutionary world will look like, but we're sort of living through parts of it. A flip side of that has been part of the criticism is that where is your place for revolutionary practice in that? If, you know, for example, as Jameson asserts in a wonderful and weird chapter essay in The Valences of Dialectic, that Walmart is actually achieving the kind of sense of total representable totality by globalizing its own practices. If Walmart is somehow leading us one step closer to communism, then why fight Walmart? Like, what, you get people saying, like, well, wait a second, you're saying it's coming along anyhow, that capitalism is making it possible, because through globalization you have an international working class, all these things that Marx did in fact talk about as probably preconditions for any kind of communism. Marx wasn't really a believer in national communism so much as the international. So it makes sense that we would need capitalism to actually be global before we could even start to have communism. But on the other hand, it's like, well, what do you expect us to do with this? Just keep shopping at Walmart and hoping for the best? And Jameson's response to that has been, you know, sometimes sharp, which is that, you know, it's very easy to take a moral position where you feel better about yourself, but you're not actually helping the revolution any better by denying the degree to which Walmart's distribution chain has, you know, transformed production in a way that is radically different from an older system, and blah, blah, blah. But at the same time recognizing that, yeah, this is sort of, and this is where he gets all French, right? This sort of, I don't know, this sort of world weariness that of course the world is awful, you know, that's part of being in, you wear black and smoke Gauloise cigarettes, anyway. But then, you know, this is the world we've got. So, you know, I think there is a legitimate critique along the lines of the critique of, you know, how a new interpretation of Balzac is going to help the working class. But I think Jameson's position would remain that, you know, this is valuable work as part, not the whole, but as part of the revolutionary project. So get out there and, you know, write some criticism of Balzac. Or read some Balzac. Why not? Dan?
Yeah. You were sort of veering toward this with your Walden references, but given your long experience with Jameson, with his works, in your own view, in your own critique of Jameson, what do you see as his particular strengths? I don't necessarily, you don't have to go into weaknesses necessarily, but you know, how do you personally have you come to see him and to see it of value in his works?
Well, Jameson for me was, and I sort of joked about this at the beginning, but was a kind of bridge from philosophy to literature. I remember at the time, my feeling was really, you know, that philosophy departments were stodgy and mostly, you know, not doing enough continental, you know, hip stuff, and therefore I was still doing philosophy, but doing it in a literature department. And indeed, you know, one of the classes I took with Jameson was a class on Marx. That's all we read, was Marx in the class. And, you know, I could have probably taken a course on Marx, or at least with Marx as one of the, I did, in the philosophy department, 19th century philosophy class. And so I didn't see this as, now I'm in a literature department. But I will say this, I remember vividly, because it was Habermas's the translation rather, of Habermas's Philosophical Discourse of Modernity came out in 1987. And it was actually required in one of the classes for the philosophy department I took. Rick's class, of course. Craig Hanks wrote his dissertation on Habermas around this time, probably wasn't looking forward to seeing new books come out by Habermas while you're trying to write your dissertation. But in that, he had a chapter, sort of an excursus between chapters, on the blurring of the lines between literature and philosophy, and talking specifically about Derrida, I think, in the late 60s, early 70s. And I asked Jameson about that, because I thought that was kind of cool, you know, blurry, you know. I was never a big fan of Derrida, but I was a big fan of Foucault, and I saw Foucault as really blurring lots of lines, obviously, history and philosophy too. And Jameson was the sort of the first person to say, no, I don't think that there's blurring at all. I think literary critics do their thing, and philosophers, and that shocked me, because it's coming from such an interdisciplinary figure as Jameson, who writes about everything, who of course has a book out on Hegel, you know, and clearly writes about philosophy. But what he said is, I think the lines might be redrawn a bit, but that literary critics do their thing and philosophers do their thing, and that sometimes they overlap, but it's not exactly the same. The fields aren't blurring together. And I think that part of that was, you know, I sort of struggled to see how my interests, which at the time seemed not very literary, I mean, the philosophers I was interested in are the ones you'd expect maybe to get to in the lit theory stuff, because it was a lot of Marx and a lot of Nietzsche. I was really interested in Sartre, and so existentialism gave me a chance to do philosophy and literature together. And so it makes sense that I would have gravitated towards somebody like Jameson, but I still thought of Jameson as more or less a philosopher. I was interested in, you know, when he actually wrote about literary texts, I didn't get it, or I skimmed over it, and it wasn't until much later in grad school when I sort of had been trained by literature professors in a literature PhD program to get more out of the sort of formalism that Jameson is engaged in, and of course paying close attention to those aspects that can't simply be reduced to, well, here's the main message that we're getting to, we're just happening to use literary critics to get there, and started to see how specifically literary and literary critical the work was. So that's one thing that Jameson enabled me to do, was actually learn to do literature, something I was really doing a lousy job of trying to do earlier on. But also, I think that, that said, saying that he does all this as a literary critic and yet does lots of things, you know, that don't seem to be literature, I think it was that, the ability to make connections. And Jameson claims this is Hegelian and dialectical and Marxist, but you know, I don't think it necessarily requires those labels. He said it's all about making the connections. It's all about seeing the relationship between what seem to be discrete and unrelated events. And so, you know, he talks about how, you know, the lesson the dialectic has to tell, this is, I'm paraphrasing from Marxism and Form, is the lesson of the dialectical reversal. And he'll start talking about various events that don't seem to be related, but showing how once you look at, like, for example, the Cold War scenario that led to, I don't know, a very left-wing government in India led by Nehru, who, using more or less Stalinist policies, built a bunch of technology institutes that then helped to produce a generation of very savvy, especially technologically savvy engineers and computer people, who then were able to go to work at a time when outsourcing becomes just the keen thing to do in North American heavy industry and other areas. And it's like, oh, so, you know, you see what seemed to be a kind of left-wing socialism leading to what we typically would think of as a more right-wing or commercially oriented globalization. And of course, in some respects, that in retrospect is obvious, but, you know, the notion that you are actively seeking to make connections between otherwise unrelated things is kind of neat. Jameson refers to it also famously in the in Marxism and Form, and this is probably a kind of dated expression from a generation that would have just started doing air travel more regularly, but he talks about it as that sort of sickening shudder you get when the airplane dips suddenly. That's the feeling of the dialectic in a way. This sort of shock of recognition where it does go back to Sartre, because it goes back to suddenly realizing the materiality of your body in space and time, and he would associate that with something, you know, flat out of being in nothingness, I think. But even so, that was a big part of it for me. As far as weaknesses, I do think that Jameson makes it hard to talk about weaknesses, because whenever you go after him, he often incorporates the other argument. I will say that I think that my own interest and work, and part of this is working with other professors, of course, and reading other people, but that I find Foucault, for example, much more amenable to Jameson than Jameson does. In fact, I once had a theory, I don't have it anymore because I just can't find any evidence of it, but I once had the theory that the reason Jameson has such antipathy towards Foucault was that he must have personally insulted him at some point. Like they must have met at a cocktail party and Foucault was a dick or something. And everything I know about Foucault suggests that's possible. And it is true that they may have had overlapping, chances to me, but I just haven't found, even anecdotally, evidence of that. And that's also partially joke. I'm sure Jameson could incorporate the thought of even jerks into his system, but I think that's one of the areas that I've found productive to kind of blend Jameson and Deleuze a little bit. Jameson has always liked Deleuze, though, and Foucault in some of the stuff I've done, like the spatial theory, is kind of, not to take away credit for the brilliant ideas I came up with, all by myself, but it's basically a blend of Foucault and Jameson, and a little Deleuze, a little bit of some geographers too, but pretty much that's my theoretical work is blending that tradition. Critical work, I don't know. Robert?
You were talking about Jameson and the subtle little nuances of everything that go on around us simultaneously that we don't really pay attention to and see, but eventually over the long run you will see that all come together. It's like, oh, that was all happening all together, all at one time. And now, several years later, you can see that come to pass. And Foucault pretty much says the same thing when he's talking about how society, and how was that article that I read about Jeremy Bentham, Panopticon.
The Panopticon chapter, right?
Yeah, and how that you look at that from the multitude of the surveillance and the subtle little things that happen to all get to that more efficient state of being, and all those you don't recognize that's happening around you all at the same time, but over the long run you can see how that efficiency all comes together from that constant observation.
Absolutely, and I really think that that's one of the reasons why the sort of figure of the map is so effective, both literally what a map does, give you a sort of artificial overview of a space so that you can make sense of it in a way that presumably would be a lot harder if you were just wandering through the streets. There's a great scene in Melville's 5th book, Redburn, where Redburn comes to Liverpool for the first time, and he's so excited because he has his dad's guidebook that is badly out of date because it's already 30 years old, but also he loves it. He's been reading it the whole way across the ocean. He just can't wait. He takes out the map and looks at the map and then looks at the city, looks at the map, says, didn't look anything like it. And of course, Redburn is a very comical, foolish character in loosely based on a very young Melville the first time he would have voyaged. But that's, the map is not to be used that way, of course. It's an abstraction. It's an artificial thing. In my own stuff, talking about literary cartography, I sort of play up on that. I'm not really using real maps, and there are no illustrations in any of my writings, no maps. But the idea is sort of projecting some sort of sense of overview, some sort of sense of totality in a way, in order to make sense of it. And yes, it's artificial, and yes, it's provisional. You may not actually be able to continue using it. Things change, for example, just like you got to update your maps. But in that sense, it is a way of sort of helping navigate through the world metaphorically. I'm using the geographical metaphor, but I think Jameson, who also uses the geographical metaphor, might turn it towards the older, and again, Hegelian model of history itself. can we really imagine ourselves in the whole sweep of history where, in fact, all of this stuff is connected, but we can't see it because we can't see all of the connections or even all the things to be connected. So yeah, I think, Foucault provides a model of how that is done as well. Although, again, in Foucault's model, it tends to be valenced as a negative, like, oh my God, this is terrible. And yet, I've always thought that Foucault, like Jameson, although not citing, the dialectical tradition, one of the things Jameson will say about the dialectic is because of the reversals, we can't be moralists, right? Because what we want to condemn is actually leading to something that we might want to praise. We just don't know it yet because of the reversals, right? If we wanted to condemn Nehru for his socialist-style government because I'm a good U.S. business interest, and then later it turns out, gosh, he saved our business by giving us this great outsourcing opportunity that we wouldn't have had without that. So one of the reasons Jameson says that it's not worth being sort of moralizing, and he sort of leaves off whether something is good or bad often, is because he says we can't see whether it's good or bad in the ultimate sense because we're not there yet. For Hegel, we needed the end of history. We needed to get to a point where we can now make that judgment. The owl of Minerva takes flight at dusk, right? You guys are nodding. You haven't read the Philosophy of Right, but you should. It's a good one. Some of you have, I know. But, that sense of overview can be panoptic and can, seem like a really bad thing, but at other times it can be incredibly valuable. Like if you're lost and somebody gives you a map, or you come across that place in the mall where it says you are here, and it's like, oh, I got to be on the other side of the whole building, right? That's a useful thing, even if it's technically a form of power knowledge that is isolating bodies in space, and that's why I have a more sort of sanguine view of Foucault than maybe Foucault himself did. Yeah, Vince.
Ralph, I was wondering if Jameson commented at all on contemporary China or contemporary Marxist Chinese thinking.
He has done some. I haven't seen much that would be different than talking about China, kind of like as I was talking about India earlier, as a sort of rapidly advancing phase of capitalist development. In other words, the Marxist ideology of China's government and the fact of them being sort of hyper-capitalist as a society, economically, if not politically, is something he's commented on. As far as his relationship to China, from what I hear, they consider him a major theorist, and I don't know if that's just Marxist, like sticking up for guys who call themselves Marxists. I'm not sure that a lot of Jameson's writing is necessarily something that the Beijing government would embrace, but I think they embrace him as a Marxist theorist. I met a guy from China who said, when he was in school, people talked about Marx, Mao, Marcuse, and Jameson as like the four theorists of the... It's like, wow, they're making you guys read a lot of Jameson, I guess, but... I wasn't sure, because I heard from the 60s people used to have the Marx, Mao, Marcuse thing, so maybe they just added the latest in a line of Marcuse-like people. Jameson is not really Maoist. I mean, some of the people Jameson was inspired by in France tended to be Maoists for a while, and I'm sure, as you know, their turn to Maoism, I think, I don't want to speak for all of the French intellectuals post-war, but I think part of the turn to Maoism by people like Barthes and even Lévi-Strauss was a way to stay kind of Marxist without tainting yourself with Stalin. And to be perfectly honest, I think there was a kind of benign racism there, the notion that, Mao was also making omelets by breaking eggs, but the Chinese way of doing things is different than the Russian, and I really do think Mao kind of got a pass for the Cultural Revolution in a way that, of course, Stalin didn't for the purges. That was one of the critiques of that generation of French intellectuals later by, say the current generation, Bernard Henri Lévy, people like that. Finkelkraut, L.A. Finkelkraut, and some of the other nouveau philosophes of the 70s and 80s, who are still around, as far as I can tell. But yeah, as far as explicitly talking about Chinese culture, he has mentioned some things about Chinese cinema. His geopolitical aesthetic talks a little bit about Chinese and Soviet cinema. And his notorious essay on third world literature in an age of multinational capitalism does use as one of his examples a Chinese novel. And so he hasn't ignored China, to be sure, but yeah, as far as speaking directly to Chinese style Marxism or to the government itself, only sort of vague and general things. You know, he has mentioned, you know, in a kind of wave the red flag kind of our team is still pretty good way that, you know, when we say the end of the Cold War and the end of communism, that there is a country of 1 billion people who are still communists, and so it's not that communism did go away. But that said, we definitely recognize the Chinese system is quite different than the Soviet system or the Eastern Bloc system, for example. Not to mention other sort of putatively communist regimes like Cuba. Anybody else? Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Jeff Helgeson, sorry.
Oh sure.
Sorry,
Hey Jeff. I
came
couldn't see you from the light.
Yeah. So I just have a question kind of related to this question about current events. So one could argue that American politics, at least, and I like the fact that your work is decentering, you know, kind of the national literature of the United States and all that. I'm an American historian myself, and I try to see bigger trends through those stories. But one could argue that American politics is becoming more polarized now than it has, at least since the middle of the 1960s. And
Yeah.
you know, people like Zizek took the opportunity of Occupy Wall Street to be on YouTube, telling everybody what he thinks the world should be like. And I'm just curious if I've seen Jameson speak, and when he spoke in Chicago, it seemed like he was up here when the audience was over here in some ways, you know.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious if he's attempted to address either the you know, kind of the economic mobilization and or the Black Lives Matter mobilization in any kind of way that is both national and now, I think, connecting to a kind of transnational politics of polarizing around capitalism, polarizing around racism, and all that. And if he's addressed that.
Yeah, he has at various times sort of lent his own sort of sense of support to things like Occupy Wall Street. I know in the aftermath of the Seattle riots in the 70s, I'm sorry, in 1997, 98, 97, right? The sort of anti-globalization movement. He's in a sense lent some support. He's actually, and this is going to sound like he's, you know, speaking ex cathedra or something, but he cited Marx as an example of someone who had a theory of how this is sort of going to work and didn't think some little things here and there was necessarily part of it. For example, trade unionism. Some argued in Marx's time that actually divides the working class by trades and that it interferes with the international. And in other cases, in an almost, you know, a field you know better than I, like the sort of Barrington Moore Marcuse idea of repressive tolerance, like you're just postponing the revolution by making lives of workers a little better. Like, shouldn't we make them even worse so that they'll have to revolt, right? And that's an awful thing to say to people who are actually already miserable, that we can't let you get a little better now for fear that you won't get a lot better later. So I think Jameson's feeling is that, you know, Marx actually supported a lot of these initiatives even if he didn't think they were where the revolution was going to happen. Sometimes violent revolution, sometimes just trade unionism, sometimes lobbying for a shorter workday, or supporting the famous, you know, law to eliminate child labor below age 12, I think, or was it below age 8, something like that. These sort of things, I think, Jameson has sort of gestured towards. I have to say that I wasn't, when Occupy Wall Street was going on, some people were citing Jameson, but he didn't seem to be a great tutelary spirit to the organizers. And I almost wonder if, not to, you know, turn Occupy Wall Street into a, you know, 1870s debate, but at some of the old anarchism versus Marxism arguments, even going back to Bakunin and Kropotkin, might eliminate some of this, because I think a lot of the Occupy Wall Street rhetoric was more anarchistic than, properly speaking, Marxist. And I take that as a critique of the state, but also, of course, critique of corporations, less than a critique of the economic system itself. Jameson would say, following Marx, for example, corporations aren't the enemy, capitalism is, right? The system itself. In the meantime, paying workers better is probably a good idea. And in the meantime, having more access to more democratic system, for example, by getting corporate funding out of political races. Overturn Citizens United was one of the Occupy Wall Street goals, for example. I think Jameson would support all of that for sure, but yeah, I'm not sure. He certainly did not become the figure that Zizek has become in that movement. Zizek is a fun guy. Zizek is sort of a clown, but delighted to be one, I think. And I don't mean that as an insult. Well, a little bit as an insult. Jameson, not so clownish in that sense. Well, thanks everybody for coming. This was great.
Thank you,
I'm
Rob.
honored, absolutely honored to be the first. Thank you.